My name is Robin Bishop. I am the Commercial Director of Impactt, and I am going to be your host and moderator for today's event. We're going to do things a little bit differently today than perhaps a normal webinar. And essentially, we really want to spend time drilling down and discussing this topic in a facilitated conversation format. We want plenty of time to engage you, our peers, on this subject to hopefully drive a really robust conversation. Joining me today are my colleagues, Michael Pennant-Jones and Fira Safira. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of an introduction to them in a minute, but first just to go through a couple of the housekeeping bits. Many of you, when you first came in, will have heard that this session is being recorded. So just to kind of give you the heads up on that. As much as we love seeing all of your handsome faces, we would ask you to please keep your cameras off and to keep yourselves on mute. My colleague David, who is sitting here with me, will be helping to field questions and collate them. And we want some challenging questions. Let's really dig deep into this subject. So please do submit them via the chat box, and we will pepper those throughout the presentation, but we'll also leave time at the end. So if you have a pressing question, please do share it with us. In terms of introducing my colleagues, first of all, apologies, my picture hasn't come up and that wasn't deliberate, my apologies. Michael is Impactt's Director of Consultancy Services. He's got more than 20 years experience in environmental and social sustainability. He has also been advising clients for the past 2 decades in their journey to remedy labor rights issues on a systemic level. And in addition, he's provided advice to resolve high-risk grievances, including forced labor and human trafficking cases. Fira is a principal tech consultant and focuses on our technical and quality work at Impactt. And she's got more than 8 years of professional experience in sustainable supply chains and ethical sourcing. She has led a wide range of labor risk assessment and remediation programs, including establishing and monitoring independent grievance lines on behalf of clients from manufacturing, agriculture, construction, and retail. So a very experienced bunch here today. We've noted about an hour for today's session, but as I said, please do shout out any of your questions in the chat box or comments. If you disagree, let us know, and we'll try and really run this as a good, robust conversation around this issue. So there's no slides. We're just going to talk. And I wanted to start today by asking our speakers to really help us set the scene. So look, most of you on the line today, you're fairly au fait with grievance mechanisms, what they are and what they do. We really want to start by setting the scene and defining at Impactt, when we talk about a grievance mechanism, what do we mean and the purpose, what purpose do we feel they serve? Michael, let's kick it off.
Okay, good afternoon. Conceptually, grievance mechanisms are about having effective channels for workers to raise grievances, concerns, or simply ask questions where they'll receive remedy, assistance, or answers. These channels should ideally be multi-layered, and what we're talking about is at various levels within and outside an organisation. An example might be a worker through their trade union representative, or it could be through their health and safety committee or a gender committee. It could be another layer might be with workers and management at site level, or it could be in an internal company helpline or channel with head office. Ultimately, it could be an independent anonymized channel on a telephone line, etc., which is often the very last safety net. So when we talk conceptually about grievance channels, we talk about layers of grievance channels, because ultimately to have effective management of the issue, you need to build the capacity and capability, and we're going to talk about this a lot more, of the company or site to manage most issues themselves. So it's quite right that a lot of those layers are within the organisation. So today, while we'll predominantly talk about external anonymous channels, you have to see these within the context of a multi-layered approach to grievance resolution. So what purpose do we see that grievance mechanisms provide? We think our Impactt view is that they give voice to worker problems. They provide access to all employees, the contractors, subcontractors, sometimes family and community, to seek remedy proportionate with the issue. In other words, a grievance channels both diagnosis and remediation in two ways. One is for the individual, because it allows the individual to raise a workplace issue, if reported early enough, prevent it becoming a serious problem, and it provides them with effective resolution. For the company site, it helps identify systemic issues and allows them to put in place a much larger remediation program and changes to the current way of working. But there's a third one, which is that grievance mechanisms also bring a voice to remedy, and that workers can report sustained and positive impact or no or limited impact. In other words, using it as an ongoing monitoring tool.
Okay, so what's coming across very clearly is yes, they do provide effective channels to give voice to workers. But this other critical piece of the puzzle is that this voice not only needs to be heard, but it has to be acted on in the form of remedy or assistance or answers. It's not a mechanic for just one-way communication and inaction. Now, Michael, this may sound good in principle to our colleagues who are logging on today, but in reality, the picture may be very different to them. Can you share a little bit more, please, on how one would begin to start positioning grievance mechanisms in this remediation light and why it is so much more beneficial to think of them in this way?
We often think of grievance channels as a one-way street of reporting issues. But for any company or site that has a grievance channels, the big area is the back end, which is the grievance, is the ability to have the capacity, capability, and mandate to make changes in the workplace for the individual or systemically that is demonstrable, timely, and effective. In other words, it's the outcomes of that grievance channel complaint or issue that really kind of is a core piece to any effective grievance channel. The benefits of reimagining this are effective remedy builds trust with workers, between employees and management. And it can result in a workforce feel empowered and respected. And this has significant benefits for retention, morale, productivity, and engagement of workers at the site. They know they're being listened to. They know their concerns are being acted on. An example, we've got one large customer who monitors the levels of which grievances are managed and the numbers and what they look like and closed effectively. And worker feedback is that this company is the only one in the sector that most of them would ever want to work for. So much so that they actually tell their colleagues in other countries who migrate to work there, if you're coming to this sector, this is the company you work for. Do not go to the other ones. In other words, this company takes care of you. Additional to that, it assists sites and companies be compliant with international standards because it allows that self-monitoring. It allows companies to self-regulate performance, especially importantly outside of the audit window. But it also forces them to build the internal capacity and capability to enable sustained change because monitoring is about an ongoing assessment of performance.
Okay, you've sold me. Brilliant. It's hugely beneficial. But Fira, how do we get started? I mean, what preparation would, if I was thinking from the client side, what would we need to start doing internally from our side to support the handling and resolving of these cases?
We think, well, just as a start, it's important to make sure that the channel is as human as possible. So it needs to be accessible and as easy to use as possible. And at the back of it, you need to get the management buy-in, especially the mid-level management at the site, be it the supervisors or the managers, and there needs to be a capacity of the team that would be handling the cases all the way from investigations to closing the case by providing remediations to each of the grievance that has been raised through whatever channels. So all these needs to be communicated to the workers as well.
This point about keeping it human is super interesting and obviously a hallmark of the way that we like to do things at Impactt. This, though, presents challenges when it comes to thinking about scale. How do we ensure we keep this human element when we're thinking about scale, Fira?
I think the most sustainable way in driving the scale whilst keeping it as human as possible, all the human element to it, is by slowly having the plan to transition the line or the grievance mechanisms from the anonymous channels to a place where workers are comfortable speaking with their management directly by having a direct dialogue. So this in turn requires workers to be organized. So it could be something informal, such as workers' committees, like Michael mentioned. It could be through health and safety committees or gender committees or workers' well-being committees, or something a little bit more formal, which is a workers' union. But this would require changes in the workplace culture for some of the sites that we've seen. It's also important not to see the anonymous channel as a long-term or huge-scale solution, because eventually we see the anonymous channel as the last safety net in terms of identifying issues at the workplace. But at the same time, this would need to be kept in balance with understanding when to seek assistance in solving or providing remediations for especially sensitive cases such as sexual harassment.
Yeah, really interesting. Michael, tech, what role does this play in your opinion?
Tech is very important in this, but we mustn't lose sight of what the key point is in this, which is the human part. So whatever tech solution we build around this, having that human element in the loop is absolutely imperative. You know, if you're a Nepali worker in Malaysia who's got a particular sensitive issue, phoning up a high-tech line where you might get passed anonymously from one center to another is not going to build trust with you. Phoning through to somebody who might be another Nepali on the other end, who empathizes, who understands your position, who handles your case throughout, really helps build trust, helps make sure that the line works really well. So tech is great, and there's some fantastic solutions out there, but hey, the human element is essential to having a grievance line that's trusted.
Through talking to somebody at the end of whatever, be it aligned or messages, but it's a person responding.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, as we are thinking about this, you know, we're talking about keeping it human, keeping those real people at the end of a line, trying to achieve scale. What are some other challenges that we think people need to be made aware of as they, you know, make this transition to really viewing grievance, these mechanisms as this remedy tool?
The challenges really comes, it's different challenges at different stages. In the beginning, you would face challenges in terms of not having enough workers' participations. You could see that from numbers of grievances raised by the workers, and also the mid-level management, especially in the beginning when you're introducing the line or whatever channels you're having, the buy-in from management. Either they're not committed, or even worse, they're against the implementations of any channels. Once you get through that hurdle and you have workers calling in, you'd have challenges in terms of keeping workers' identity anonymous, especially when workers are still very much in fear of retaliations. And when you come up with the cases, when you have to deal with cases that requires workers' identity to be revealed, for example, when worker needs medical attention. And once you manage that, there would be, you know, workers calling in, they trust the system, they trust there will be no retaliations, and suddenly you have a huge number of calls. Then the challenge would be making sure that you can provide the remediation in the effective and timely manner, and balancing it with the scale and the quality of resolutions that you're providing to the workers. So really the challenges would be different in the stages that you are introducing the grievance line.
I'm interested, case resolutions, what kind of cases are we seeing?
Really depend on the site itself. So from the lines that we're managing, the cases are ranging from simple requests of information like policy, procedures, and company's practice, all the way to high-risk cases such as intimidations and physical violence. Ideally, workers should be comfortable enough asking about policies, procedures, and whatnot directly to the management or their employers at the workplace. But I think perhaps more important than type of issues is the issues reported themselves should reflect the actual reality on the ground. So what we mean by this is sort of issues on which we see workers are typically comfortable reporting during an assessment or investigations are also coming up through the grievance channels. An example that we see quite often is that workers are very comfortable making sure that the interviewers or the assessors know how unsafe they feel at the workplace due to poor health and safety practices like lack of PPE or lack of training in operating heavy machineries. But when we ask them whether they've reported the issues or whether they would be comfortable raising the issues through the grievance channels, most of them would say no for various reasons, from fear of retaliation to lack of trust that their report will be followed up with any actions by the management.
Great. Now,
in other words, we can use the channel to feed back to management that they need to improve their systems and the way they respond at site level, and that increases that systemic change you can make within that business.
Great. And Fira, as you were starting, we had an accidental unmuting. So I took a couple notes of what you were saying, and it's just for those of you who couldn't hear it, it ranging from wanting information on policies and procedures to some really nasty stuff in terms of very bad intimidation, physical violence, sexual violence, some very kind of, very sensitive subjects. As I reflect on looking through the audience list, I would say to both of you that most of our audience today, I'd say all of us that are working in this space, we buy into this. We want to create platforms where workers are sharing their experience with us and helping to, as you say, really reflect the reality on the ground. You've mentioned trust a lot. Trust is vital. How are we going to ensure that the workers in our supply chain trust and actually use this grievance mechanism that we're talking about implementing?
In a lot of the cases, one of the most effective ways we've seen is by introducing the grievance line or refreshing workers' memory of an existing one in parallel with some sort of improvement programs. So you could do, for example, a large-scale remediations of recruitment fees, repayment of recruitment fees, or just a simple program on, for example, providing more days of maternity and paternity leave beyond what's required by legal requirements. So these types of programs and introducing it at the same time, or refreshing the existing grievance line mechanism at the same time of running these programs, we've really seen a huge increase in numbers of grievances being raised because workers can see that changes are happening. So they have more confidence in the management taking actions on whatever they would report. But of course, there's the mechanics behind it on educating the workers on how the process works, the anonymity, and all the humanizations of the channels.
So I'm hearing loud and clear, tangible change is critical and that action has to be taken. Thinking about trust and anonymity, if one of the objectives of these mechanisms is to improve communication and relationships on site, Michael, does an anonymous channel get in the way of this?
No, simple answer. There's certain types of issues where workers are still more comfortable reporting through anonymous channels. An example might be bribery and corruption, because bribery and corruption is one of those things you don't know where it stops. You might know one person in the chain, but you might not know 3 or 4 others. So you might want to go anonymously. Another one is sexual violence, where given the sensitivity, anonymity is essential. We had an example where an employee was being sexually abused by a person in a position of power. The people who reported were the victim's colleagues. They didn't know what to do. So they came to an anonymous helpline and said, what do we do? How do we handle this? Where do we, we want to report it, but we're doing it on behalf of somebody who doesn't know we're contacting you. A call to anonymous channels should not be seen as something negative. It shows that workers still have confidence that issues can be resolved. Therefore, that should be seen as something positive. But we should position anonymous grievance channels as the last safety net. On that example, it was quite good they came through to us, because the perpetrator was actually part of a criminal gang that was subsequently uncovered. And the victim was removed to a place of safety.
quite shocking examples and really heavy stuff. Some less heavy stuff, in relatively speaking, in terms of things like bribery and corruption, but, talking about highly sensitive subjects like sexual violence. When do we as companies make the call on when grievances should be addressed internally or / informally? Or when do we need to bring in independent mediation or arbitration with the third party? What do you guys think?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky question because, of course, it will be like case by case basis, but in general, there are several considerations that we've always used internally to make the judgment call. So first is looking into the company's infrastructure. Would the internal team have the capacity and capability required? So this would mean that whether the cases are in high risks or low risk in nature, how sensitive it is from the external point of view, from your buyers, from your local communities and all that. So like Michael mentioned, the example would be sexual harassment case, but also making sure to understand that the grievance channel is not a substitute for a law enforcement in these types of cases, especially when cases are closer to crime rather than a simple workplace issues. And remediation would normally be regulated or provided through the legal channels. However, having said that, deciding whether to go through an independent mediation or arbitration with a third party should be made by those who are directly involved in the case itself, particularly the ones in the more vulnerable positions. So normally this would be the worker or the person who are making the report. Therefore, the second consideration would be what the workers want, i.e. worker-centric approach. The third consideration is who is the accused party or perpetrator. So for example, you would have cases such as union busting. So that's between the union and the management most of the time. And in this case, effective remediation would definitely require a third-party assistance. So that's really ranging case-by-case basis. But those are the three things that we normally use to consider.
Just one point on that. When we put in helplines or anonymous grievance channels, and we look at putting in layers of grievance channels within their operations, it's an ongoing dialogue with the client, sometimes quite a robust dialogue, to whether they've got the capability and capacity. So we're always at a position where we understand with the client and they understand which ones the external party will handle and which ones they will handle depending on their capability and capacity. So.
Yeah, sometimes capability could be something as simple as whether the people investigating speak the same language as the workers, for example.
Super interesting. Talking about capability and capacity, I'm hearing a lot about investment and resource, and I'm conscious that many of our colleagues and peers are on the call thinking, yeah, that's all well and good, guys, but I have a limited budget. Michael, what advice would you give them?
Sorry, that was muted. I'm going to split this into two, those companies that have one and those companies that don't at this point in time. For those companies that have one, we see a lot of grievance lines that are often one way. They have limited capability, capacity, or mandate to enforce effective remediation. And therefore, to an extent, they're not going to succeed long term. So you have to question whether that's going to be a good use of resources and money, because it is essential and critical that site also invest in a remediation support to enable remediation. For those that don't, my message would be, firstly, don't invest in one-way grievance systems, okay? You look to reduce potentially the audit burden, okay? The beauty of grievance channels is they allow ongoing monitoring and resolution of issues, especially if you've invested in the back end. Tailor remediation programs that you might have to work with grievance channels. I would also look whether to work with other brands, companies, or manufacturers to share cost and build in layers of grievance channels with companies or sites. What I would say is that over time, if it's done well, sites will become self-regulating and external grievance channels will cost less and less because they're going to be used less. But to an extent, you're always going to have a trusted anonymous safety net at the background just to catch anything else that might fall through.
Understand. So imagine we've secured the investment, we've got up and running, we've followed Fira's tips on how we get started. What would success look like to you guys? Fira, what would success look like to you?
Several things, but if we're taking a worker-centric approach, it's ultimately the workers' feedback on how satisfied they are of the outcome of their grievances, but also looking into the types of cases that are reported, whether simple things are reported directly to the management rather than to the anonymous channels, because as repeatedly mentioned, that should be the last safety net. Also, the types of resolutions, whether it's addressing the system or is it just always addressing the case-by-case basis. So you keep on having same cases repeatedly being reported, which means you haven't addressed the root cause. Anything else, Michael?
No, I think for me, if the remedy part doesn't function effectively, workers will lose faith and stop using the channels. And any grievance channel must demonstrate its effectiveness in providing tangible outcomes to address workers' concerns in a timely manner. Simple.
Brilliant. It's very clear what we think. What about the audience? This is time now to pose those questions or challenge some of the thoughts that we've shared today, or just comment and to share your own experiences of what you're finding when it comes to using grievance mechanisms as remedy. So I'd love to put this out to the field. If you'd like to type your question in the chat box, or you could raise your hand. And between David and I, we can figure out how to call you out. But you please do post your questions. Tumbleweed silence. Interesting. You know, I mean, are there people on the call, and Michael and Fira, what do you think? Do we even need grievance lines? Do we think grievance mechanisms? What do we think? You know, if I was thinking about getting started in this, would I need one? What would you say? What's your thoughts?
I think they're really good tools to get companies to build their internal capability and capacity to manage grievances. I think they shine a mirror on what might be missing in a lot of companies, in that we do a lot of audits, we do a lot of diagnostics in the industry, but actually the proof in this is, can you remedy effectively? And grievance channels are really good at showing that mirror. Can you manage these resolutions effectively? You know, I've looked at quite a few grievance channels, and we've looked at them when we've done assessments, and some of them actually just report issues. It's a real second or even third thinking to have any effective remediation in place. As long as they're closed some way, that's good. But I think if it's well done, it's a really great mirror on where that site stands on managing their human rights.
Really interesting. Kate Larson, I see you've raised your hand. Would you like to unmute? I'll unmute you, and there you go.
Hi, thanks. Just regards to your question a second ago, should we have grievance mechanisms? We set up multi-brand collaborations in Hong Kong and China many years ago, worker helpline grievance mechanisms with ongoing WeChat and other texting back and forth with anonymous workers. I mean, we would get into the factories and train it face to face, but then their interactions were on anonymous, ongoing, and absolutely. My Chinese and Asian colleagues who I worked with who cared about the issues felt that this was something we absolutely should continue to provide to workers, because we would give more of them a chance to raise their concerns. There's only so many people you can talk to in an audit. And in some sites, yes, they would use internal mechanisms, but that wasn't always appropriate, or sometimes they just had queries and they didn't want to sort of waste their management or HR managers' time. A handshake, Inner Handshake South China, who ran one of the key ones, would say that a lot of the calls were about depression and other issues that migrant workers face. But then that can often be sort of overlapped with issues about excessive overtime, etc. And yes, I would second the message that you're all saying, which is that these only work if you're willing to do the work on influencing and helping suppliers to deliver remediation, to actually improve on those issues. So, for example, 1 day rest in 7 was something that management would say, oh, but workers want more overtime. And workers would say, well, there's a balance. We do want overtime, but we want 1 day rest in 7. And so causing that was an example of causing remediation around something that was of greater concern to workers than everybody else had realized.
Super interesting points. Thank you, Kate. Kate, for that contribution. Michael and Fira, would you like to comment on that?
I think there's a couple of points. I think the first one is, I think grievance lines are really good post-audit for people that don't want to share on at the time, or they don't get access to interviewers. So they're a really good tool for that. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's getting any learning you're getting from the workers or any issues, how you see that resolution of those issues at site. And that, as you said, it can be not just on a straightforward human rights issue, it could be on culture, it could be on mental health, etc. That allows management to build that back into their business, but also shows that I suppose the capacity they need to manage our workers' expectations or workers' requirements as well.
Yeah, and especially if it's driven by a brand, and to capture the issues at the supplier's side, remediation should be driven by the site itself, so that it would improve workers' trust towards their own management thing, rather than falling back into that anonymous channels.
Absolutely. I'm going to move on. Celine has posted a question. We've got some questions coming in fast and furious. And Celine would like to know, how do we draw the line on data collection / visibility of issues from indirect workers / suppliers? Often we're talking about the deeper tier suppliers, not those not directly employed by us, especially around the GDPR regulations and co-employment risks. And I'm also going to throw out another one to you. How do we respond? Alex has asked, how do we respond to the criticism of anonymous feedback channels and technology-based platforms that they allow companies to avoid essentially meaningful grievance channels and remediation, e.g. through collective bargaining agreements? I'm really interested in that. So if you guys want to have a think about drawing the line on the data collection and how far down we go in terms of indirect workers and suppliers, and also criticism of anonymous feedback channels, i.e. using it as a way to avoid meaningful grievance channels and remediation. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, on the second one, how would you respond to criticism of anonymous feedback channels? I don't see why anyone should pay for one of those channels, because actually it's not really doing anything effective. So why invest in something that's a bit of a tick box? There are channels for grievances. Some of them are traditional, like CBAs and trade unions. We should look to strengthen those in addition to putting in meaningful other channels. So, yeah, anything to add on that?
Yeah, but the criticism is about anonymous feedback channels is seen as a platform to avoid meaningful grievance. I mean, if there is no meaningful grievance, workers are not going to be calling in to begin with. So you could see whether the channels are working or not. And in terms of collective bargaining agreements, well, collective bargaining agreements is addressing group grievances, because it's something that you would negotiate it with the management. So it's a negotiation between workers and the management. So it's an outcome. Whereas the channels is, as we've mentioned in the beginning, it will be through the worker representatives. So I don't see this as something contradicting. It's just a different types of channels and different types of outcomes, because grievance mechanisms in terms of like technology-based and anonymous channels, because it's a last safety net, most often we see this as the types of cases reported are individual types of cases, like sexual harassment. You're not going to be comfortable talking about sexual harassment through your worker representatives, for example, which would be where you would be negotiating collective bargaining agreements. So those two are the difference between like a group grievances versus individual grievances.
Thanks. And any thoughts on Celine's question around data collection and where we draw the line and how far down we go?
It's quite a difficult one. We tend to find that our grievance lines are anonymous ones. We will get a large number of workers who don't necessarily work for that company phoning in with numbers of other issues. It could be they are part of a subcontractor or a contractor. It could be they're a family or friend, or they're adjacent to the sites. It could be they're at another site. We have to, it's quite difficult. We have to draw a line at some point to say, actually, that's nothing to do with us. But then we signpost them elsewhere and don't hold their data. But anyone that's impacted by that site, then we've got to look at that as part of the scope.
In terms of data collection of disability, sometimes we don't even know who are calling, because when they say they want to stay anonymous, they don't tell us their names. They're using a new number each time they're calling us. So this is not a fixed number where we could call them back. So yeah, in terms of GDPR or data, there are times where we don't even know who are calling. We just know the issues, and then we looked at the sites and said there is this issues, and then an investigation, a general investigation would begin.
Right, really, yeah, absolutely. Neil's asked a very, hi Neil, Neil's asked a very interesting question, that there are always particular issues impacting women workers. So what do we need to do to ensure that women workers are comfortable using these mechanisms?
By proving that something is going to be done when you report the systems, when you report through whatever channels that you're reporting to. So I think particularly when it comes to sexual harassment cases, when we internally pick up these types of cases through a grievance channel, normally there is already a case being resolved either through an investigation we did or through an assessment where something like this is reported, and then there is a remediation at the back of that. Similar types of cases would start to come up from the line. So again, demonstrating remediations. From there, words would spread, and before you know it, you would have a lot of cases, and then you would face the problems of capacity, which is a beautiful problem that you would want to have rather than not having enough calls.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, we have another question that's really interesting. We talked about the kind of building blocks of really getting this off the ground. How do you build management buy-in? I would almost think about this from two angles, really. How do you build management buy-in on the site, but also how do you build management buy-in when you're looking at, you know, this expansion of a grievance where you're going to need more investment and more capacity?
Jump in as well if you're on this one. Sites, you know, no company or no site likes being told to do X, Y, and Z. They'd much rather resolve it themselves if they can. So, but often they don't know how to do that. So giving them the tools or giving them the support to enable them to manage grievances at different levels is essential, and taking them through that, how that works. And to be honest, a lot of managers take great pride in being able to resolve issues effectively thereafter, or you've strengthened the trade union worker component or the committees, etc. So they don't want you coming and hitting them over the head every time and saying you're doing it wrong. Nobody likes that. So giving them the tools to say, actually, you can manage 80% of this yourself helps get buy-in. If you can demonstrate to them that actually what's good for your business is good for what's good for your workers is also good for your business. You know, you got happier workers, more engaged, etc., you tend to have higher productivity and retention. So trying to get them to understand the business case that actually this works all round within the business is essential. You want to talk about the investment piece, or Charlotte?
Go ahead.
Okay, at a higher level, if you're talking about the investment pieces, we're all looking in this space to see effective remediation at sites. We all want to have compliance with human rights standards. Making sure that we focus on tools that enable us to get to that, rather than going around a loop of continuous pieces of work which actually maybe do not have the outcomes that we want, is essential. And I think if we look at grievance channels in terms of the layers and long-term aim, which is to transfer most of that to the site, you can see, one, it's sustainable change, makes sustained change, allows them to be monitored, but also it reduces the cost long term. because it takes the issue of compliance much more internal within that site. So I think it's a very good business case for people to start thinking, actually, this is a way we can actually change how we manage human rights for the positive.
Absolutely. Rosie's asked a question about duplication when multiple brands are setting up their own grievance mechanisms and sharing similar supply chains and asking the same suppliers to take part. It's almost grievance mechanism fatigue, like audit fatigue. What approaches could brands take essentially to reduce this possibility? Kate has fed back in the chat box, but interested to understand what the Impactt approach would be.
This is one of those, can you have too many grievance channels running at the same time? I mean, in theory, of course, too many channels would be confusing for workers, which one to use, but ultimately they would choose the one that they trust the most. We rarely see, when multiple channels are running at the site, we very rarely see the same cases or the same worker reporting their issues to two different channels. They would normally fall back to the channel that they trust the most. But yeah, agree with Katie, brand collaborations would be most effective, I think, in terms of investments as well.
I would say the critical point in this is not having multiple channels. It's actually having the same focus on remediation. So that back end, if you've got one approach to remediation at site of the issues, that's where the problem would arise. If you've got multiple different approaches.
Understand. A question's been asked, and I think it's a really good question on, and I know we have some real strong examples in Impactt, which is why I'm going to bat this one to you, on how you actually build the trust using a system. Like when we're talking about these horrific situations that some of these poor people are having to endure, like the sexual harassment case, you know, are there recommendations on how we create that trust through the system?
For people to engage first, a lot of communication. At the site, if it's a particularly bad site, a lot of communication. It helps if a third party can get people on the ground to brief them. Use existing channels such as trade unions, committees, workers' committees to spread the message. And what you tend to find is you'll then get a couple of people who will be the first kind of movers who will phone the helpline and see. And it's imperative that those first callers receive fantastic service, get their issues resolved, they see it. As soon as that happens, the grapevine will open up and they'll tell all their colleagues, it works. But it's really built around proving it works, but the pace at which you make sure that resolution comes to those first few cases is absolutely critical.
That maintain the trust, yeah.
Yeah, so we've kind of, that's really helpful. I think we've semi sort of answered that last sort of question. When we talk about, the question was really around how grievance mechanisms, our approach impacts, ensures transparency and issues are addressed accordingly. How do we manage that?
Transparency in terms of following up with cases, I think the most important stakeholder here is the person who are reporting the case itself, because often it could be something really sensitive that they're reporting through the system. So transparency, the way we see it, it doesn't mean that we are announcing it to everybody that what type of individual cases that are coming in, but transparency is making sure that if there is a systemic changes that needs to happen, these are communicated to everybody, but not by addressing, you know, but not by announcing the individual cases that are coming through.
On the trust part, it doesn't matter whether it's a CSO or it's a company or whoever. The workers got to trust the line. And the trust mostly comes through not who they are, but whether they have managed to get change or had their issues remedied.
Yeah, hence going back to the point and why we've always seen huge number of calls, an increase in number of calls whenever it's coupled with a remediation or an improvement programs of some sort.
That's super helpful. To just kind of summarize, unless anyone has any other questions that they'd like to pose, just as we think about it in this, with this lens of this remediation piece, just what are, just to remind everybody, the indicators that this is working, the formula for success. Can we just summarize once more what this good practice would look like?
Grievance channels equals successful remedy for workers. That's what success looks like. It looks like remedy and sustained change at site, both for the workers and to allow the organisation to change.
Brilliant. Well, I'd like to thank everybody, especially to thank Michael and Fira today for robust conversation. For those of you in the audience who posed questions and made comment, thank you very much. Of course, we are available all the time. So do come to us if you'd like to delve a little deeper into how you actually get this up and running. Please stay tuned for the next in this series of sort of Impactt insights, and wishing all of you a wonderful rest of your Wednesday evening. Thank you very much, and we will speak to you again soon.